Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight's episode is titled, Surviving the Cold Nights of the Dark Ages. In this quiet, slow, and lengthy journey through time, we'll explore how ordinary people, not kings, not warriors, not saints, but humble medieval peasants, endured some of the coldest nights in human memory. From the flicker of a smoky hearth fire to the damp, muddy floors of earth-walled homes, we will slowly, methodically, and softly unravel the near-forgotten routines of warmth, resilience, and basic survival that define daily life in the darkest corners of the Dark Ages. Before we begin, if your eyes grow heavy during this story, that's perfectly okay. But if you're still with me, I'd love for you to leave a comment down below. Share how you're feeling right now. Are you cold? Are you relaxed? Are you picturing yourself wrapped in old woolen layers, curled up in a medieval hut? Your thoughts are always welcome here. And now, we begin. It's the year 842. The sun has set early, as it always does, in the long, grim months of winter in northern Europe. In a remote village, nestled between dense forests and unforgiving hills, silence falls over a small cluster of wooden homes with thatched roofs. There is no streetlight, no glowing window panes, just the wind, brushing against the huts, and the very occasional crackle of firewood from within. The cold is penetrating. It creeps in through the unsealed wooden slats of walls, through gaps in the ill-fitted doors, and through the rough, hand-woven fabric that covers the windows. In one of these homes, little more than a single-room structure, with packed earth floors and no chimney, a family of 5 prepares for another long night. The home smells of damp wool, ash, and the slightly sour scent of cabbage stew, long gone. The fire at the center of the hut is low, not for lack of need, but because firewood is limited. Peasant families often had to stretch what little they could collect. Gathering wood was exhausting and not always permitted. Forests were often under the control of the local lord. To gather too much, or to cut from the wrong tree, could mean punishment. So the family does what they must. They huddle. They bring their bodies close. The parents and their 3 children, aged perhaps 7 to 15, lie on a shared straw bed, stuffed with reeds and covered with layers of coarse wool and old linen. There are no pillows, just folded tunics or furs. Their outer clothing remains on. In winter, you slept in everything you owned, even shoes. Sometimes, if frost threatened your toes, above them, a wooden loft holds sacks of grain, and sometimes, small animals, chickens or piglets, might be brought indoors to survive the cold. Their warmth and their occasional soft noises are part of the night's soundscape. In some households, livestock were kept inside deliberately, with a thin, wooden divider separating them from the humans. The animals added precious warmth, and it was easier to guard them from thieves or wolves. The peasants' winter diet helped with warmth too. Heavy foods, pottage, dark bread, beans, and sometimes salted meat or fish provided energy. A warm meal in the evening was a rare comfort, often accompanied by a weak ale or heated water with herbs. The stewpot often remained on the fire, simmering continuously, with new ingredients added each day. This perpetual stew absorbed the essence of each day's meal, creating a thick and nourishing mixture, sometimes called perpetual pottage, which carried on for weeks. But food alone could not ward off the cold. Insulation, in the modern sense, didn't exist. Walls were often daubed with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure, a technique known as wattle and daub. While better than bare wood, it did little against truly bitter temperatures. Roofs made of thatch, carefully layered, provided some insulation, but allowed drafts to slip through. Snow would sometimes fall through if the roof was worn. Ice formed on the inside of walls, to fight the chill. People sometimes placed hot stones at their feet, wrapped in cloth. These stones, heated in the fire, released warmth slowly. But again, firewood was scarce, and using it for comfort rather than cooking was a luxury few could afford. Some families rotated who would tend the fire at night, waking every few hours to stoke the embers, careful not to let them die. Reigniting a fire from scratch, especially in darkness, was far from easy. Fires were built on stone slabs or directly on the ground. Without chimneys, smoke lingered inside, rising through holes in the roof or seeping out through the thatch. The air was heavy, often smoky, making eyes water and lungs ache. But the smoke also served a purpose. It helped to preserve meat hanging from rafters, deter pests, and even protect the thatch roof from insects. It was not uncommon for eyes to itch and coughs to persist through the night. But that was part of the cost. A smoky room was warmer than a freezing one. There were no candles, not for peasants. Tallow, made from rendered animal fat, was used when available, but it was unpleasant, smelly, and expensive. Instead, they relied on the firelight and the dim glow of embers. Shadows flickered across walls, elongating and dancing softly. The darkness was not just physical, but a way of life. Nightfall signaled rest, and there was little to do but sleep. Peasant nights were long. In deep winter, darkness could last over 14 hours. There was no scrolling on phones, no reading by lamplight. Time passed slowly. People often experienced segmented sleep, waking after 4 or 5 hours, then dozing again later. During this middle time, people prayed, tended to fires, talked quietly, or even ventured outside to relieve themselves if they dared. And it was cold outside. The outhouse, if there was one, was a wooden box with a hole, placed away from the home to avoid odor. Otherwise, people used chamber pots, or simply relieved themselves in the forest. Frostbite was a known risk, though they had no name for it. They described it as the blackening of flesh, the death of toes and fingers. And many simply lived with the damage. Warmth was survival, but it was also a privilege. Inside the hut, a few dried herbs might hang from beams: lavender, rosemary, sage, not for decoration, but to ward off spirits and scent the air. These herbs were believed to protect against miasma or bad air, thought to cause illness. The smell of mold, smoke, sweat, and animal musk filled every breath. This was the atmosphere of winter in a peasant home. And yet, people survived. They survived by adapting, by enduring, by sharing what little they had. They told stories, passed down quietly, to keep each other company in the dark. They learned to read the wind, to feel snow in their bones before it arrived. They layered furs over cloth, covered walls with old hides, and lay side by side, not just for love, but for heat. This was their night, not glamorous, not warm, but very real. And now, as you lie wherever you are, warm or cool, perhaps with a blanket or a pillow, take a moment to picture that small hut, the crackle of a single flame, the soft breath of 5 sleeping bodies, a silence deeper than we know today. Outside, the wind whispers through the skeletal branches of bare winter trees. The village is quiet, and darkness reigns unchallenged. It is not the kind of darkness we know today, softened by the glow of street lamps or the blinking of distant cities. No, this darkness is full and deep, wrapping around the countryside like a thick woolen cloak. Even the moon, partially veiled by low-hanging clouds, offers little illumination. Shadows are few. Everything is one long hush dot in the distance. A wolf howls, not the dramatic, echoing kind so often imagined, but a short, guttural cry. And for the family inside the hut, it's just another sound of the night. No one flinches. The children stir, but only slightly. Wild animals are a danger, certainly, but not one that can be fought with fear. The door is barred, a heavy wooden plank set in iron loops. That will have to be a new sleep returns. Not the restful kind one finds in a comfortable bed, but a half-sleep. Limbs still ache from the day's labor. Back sore from bending, hauling, chopping, grinding. But this too is ordinary. The body has adapted. Cold, pain, and fatigue have all become familiar above them. In the loft, something stirs. It's a small hen, fluttering slightly. Perhaps it sensed the same wolf cry. Or perhaps the night itself unnerves it. Chickens are sensitive creatures, and the darkness brings many unseen things. But it settles again, and silence returns. Even the embers in the hearth no longer crackle. They glow, soft, red, alive but quiet. They are the last light in the hut. The hour is unknown. Time is not counted by clocks. Instead, it is measured by the body, by the shifting temperature of the air, by instinct. In the Dark Ages, peasants rose with the sun and slept with the stars. But when the coldest months arrived, December, January, and February, They often slept in segments. The first sleep might begin after supper, shortly after sunset, and last 4 to 5 hours. Then, a wakeful period, perhaps an hour or two, followed by a second sleep until dawn. This interlude was not wasted. In some homes, it was the time for quiet prayer. Others used the moment for reflection, hushed conversation, or even intimacy. One might rise slowly, stoke the fire gently, and warm a cloth-wrapped stone to slip back under the blanket. Some sat and simply listened to the wind. This practice of segmented sleep was so common that it had a name: the first sleep and the second sleep. Records from medieval texts speak of people waking after their first sleep to think, meditate, or even visit neighbors. But for peasants, most did not leave their home. The air outside was too cold, and the path too dangerous in the dark. The second sleep was usually deeper, richer, and more filled with dreams. It carried them through to morning, and it was during this phase that the fire posed its greatest risk. Fires were necessary, but they were not safe. Without a hearthstone or chimney, open flames smoldered in the center of the floor. A sudden shift of wind through a drafty wall, or the fall of a burning log, could cause disaster. Entire villages had been lost to fire. A single spark on thatch, dry and brittle in the cold, could light the sky. So a sleeping peasant would often wake suddenly, eyes opening to check the fire instinctively. If it burned too high, it had to be dampened. If it burned too low, the cold would return with cruel force. In some homes, ashes were piled over glowing embers before sleep. This technique, known as banking the fire, helped preserve heat and prevent flare-ups. In the morning, one could stir the coals and reignite the flame. But not everyone had enough ash. Not everyone had the skill. Morning approached slowly, not with a sudden light, but a gradual softening of the dark. The horizon shifted from black to deep blue, then gray. Frost coated everything: the straw roof, the wooden beams, the surface of a metal pot left too close to the wall. Breath still hung in the air, visible, even indoors. But with the promise of light came motion. First the mother rises. Her movements are quiet but deliberate. She reaches for a wool shawl, already wrapped around her shoulders from the night, and pulls it tighter. Her feet seek out her shoes, not boots, but simple leather turn shoes, worn smooth and patched repeatedly. She steps lightly so as not to wake the others. Her first task is the fire. She kneels beside the hearth, brushing aside old ash to reveal the hidden orange glow beneath. If she's lucky, it still breathes. She adds dried kindling, twigs saved from warmer months, bark curled into flakes, and coaxes it back to life. Smoke begins to rise again, curling toward the roof beams. Next comes water. She takes a clay pot and steps outside, where the morning air bites sharply. Her breath is loud, and her hands are quick. She moves to the rain barrel or the nearby stream, both crusted with ice. Breaking through, she scoops what she can: cold water, colder air, and then quickly back inside. Others stir now. The father sits up, his beard crusted slightly with condensation. The children groan, not from comfort but stiffness. The straw mattress has shifted, and their skin itches from the reeds beneath. One child coughs, another rubs frost from their eyelashes. But the fire is coming back, the light is growing, and soon the daily rhythm will begin again. Breakfast is not a meal in the sense we know. It is whatever is available. A piece of bread, if any is left, some warm water, if a little barley or oats can be added. Occasionally, a slice of cheese hardened by time, or dried fruit if they were lucky that harvest. They eat in silence, not because of custom, but fatigue. The day will be long: chores, repairs, gathering, and already the cold has taken root in their fingers, but they have survived another night. That is no small thing, and as the wind still hums through the forest, and smoke rises lazily through the thatch, another day of enduring begins, slowly, wearily, and with the resilience born not of strength, but necessity. They did not complain, they could not afford to. That was winter in the dark ages. The morning continues, slow and muted, like the light that barely breaks through the thick clouds overhead. The sun, if it can be called that, is more of a pale disk than a source of heat. It rises reluctantly, casting a dull gray glow across the frozen village. The huts, their roofs dusted with frost and smoke trailing from their tops, seem motionless, like pieces of the earth itself. Inside the modest home, life begins to return to the limbs of the family. The oldest child has taken a wooden bucket and stepped out into the icy air, heading toward the stream. Her breath leaves her mouth in slow clouds. Her hands, wrapped in woolen scraps stitched together over the years, grip the rough handle tightly. She moves carefully, mindful of the icy path, worn smooth by generations of feet. Her shoes are thin. They were never made for comfort, only for necessity. The stream is narrow, shallow, but always moving, and thus less prone to freezing entirely. She kneels by its edge, using a stick to break the thin layer of ice that's formed overnight. The water underneath flows dark and cold. She fills the bucket, the cold seeping through her gloves. The pain is immediate, but she says nothing. No one complains of the cold. The cold simply is. Back at the hut, the father tends to a few tools near the door. An axe, worn dull. A scythe with a cracked handle. A wooden spade, splintered at the end. Tools are precious, and every winter, they must be checked, cleaned, and repaired if possible. Without them, spring labor would be impossible. But fixing tools in the cold, with numb hands and no workshop, is slow work. He uses the warmth of the fire to soften the pitch needed to bind the handle. It takes time. The children prepare to help with the animals. If the family is fortunate, they might own a pig or two, maybe a goat, and a few chickens. These animals are not just companions or food. They are warmth, manure, and insurance. The animals huddle in the same cramped quarters as the humans, or in small lean-tos hastily constructed alongside the hut. Every morning, they must be fed, checked, and protected from freezing. The pigs grunt softly, their breath rising like smoke. Their bodies are thick and warm, covered in bristly hair. They push at the walls of their pen, hungry and restless. The children scatter some vegetable scraps and acorns saved from autumn. There is no surplus. Every bit is counted. Goats receive the same treatment, a handful of dried hay, a soothing word, a quick check of hooves. The chickens are last, always nervous, always alert. Their eggs, if any remain in winter, are collected with quiet celebration. Eggs in the dead of winter are rare. Hens lay less in the cold and nearly stop altogether as daylight diminishes. An egg is a treasure, rich in fat and protein. If one is found, it is shared carefully, perhaps even saved for someone who is ill or very young. Once the animals are tended, attention turns to fuel. Firewood must be gathered daily. Even with careful rationing, the hearth consumes much. Not just logs, those are valuable, and usually reserved for cooking, but branches, kindling, bark, and even dried dung. The older boy and his father set off with a wooden sled, dragging it behind them as they walked to the edges of the forest. Forests in the Dark Ages were not wild and untouched. As some imagine, they were managed, controlled, and often restricted. Many trees were considered the property of the local lord. Peasants could not simply cut what they wished. Instead, they were allowed to gather dead wood, fallen limbs, and occasionally cut small branches if they paid a fee or received permission. This morning's expedition is quiet. The forest is muffled in frost, the ground hard beneath their feet. They work with gloved hands, moving slowly through the underbrush. Branches snap easily, dry from weeks without rain. They fill the sled steadily without speaking. Conversation wastes breath. Each load must last a day, maybe two, depending on the cold. They also gather fallen leaves and dried moss, which help to start the fire faster. Back at the village, the mother kneads dough. It is coarse dark bread made from rye or barley. Wheat is rare and expensive. The flour has been mixed with water, a bit of salt, and, if lucky, a few spoonfuls of last week's sourdough starter. The dough is heavy and rough. She shapes it into round loaves, then places them near the fire to rise, not in an oven, but on a flat stone, or perhaps inside a covered pot buried in coals. Baking is slow, careful work. If the fire burns too hot, the bread will burn. If too cold, it won't bake through. The smell of bread is one of the few comforts in the hut. It fills the air with something warm and familiar. The children return, faces red from the wind, and sit near the hearth to eat their share. The bread is eaten with broth made from bones, boiled vegetables, and anything left from the last few days. It is thin, not rich, but it is warm. After the meal they rest. It is not idleness. There is always something to do, but winter days are short, and energy must be preserved. The mother repairs clothing, carefully stitching a worn tunic. Thread is expensive, and cloth more so. Every garment is patched and repatched. Holes are mended with old fabric scraps. The children assist. One sorts firewood, another checks the thatch for leaks. The youngest cleans the bowls and wooden spoons. Afternoons in winter are brief. The sun does not linger long. Shadows stretch early, and the cold deepens quickly. By late afternoon, the family prepares for evening once more. The fire is stoked, and more wood is added. The room brightens slightly. Outside, the animals are checked one last time, and the sled is brought back under cover. The bread is sliced thinly, and a second pot of broth is heated. This is supper. The family eats together, seated on low stools or directly on the floor. Conversation is minimal, not because there is nothing to say, but because voices carry in such small spaces, and silence is a kind of peace. The youngest child leans against the mother's shoulder. The others eat slowly, chewing each mouthful. Thoroughly, meals are sacred. Nothing is wasted, not a drop. As the sun disappears entirely, the family readies for bed again. The process is the same. Layers of clothing are not removed, only adjusted. They sleep in shifts of warmth, piling together. In the bed, the mother wraps the youngest in an old blanket made from scrap wool. The father places a few warm stones at their feet. The fire is checked once more, and then the night begins again. Outside, the sky darkens to black. Stars, if they can be seen through the clouds, blink coldly in the distance. The forest creaks. An owl calls once. The chill returns, creeping through every crack and gap. But inside the small hut, for now, there is warmth. There is breath. There is the quiet persistence of life. Another night in the dark ages has begun, and they are still here. The night, once again, takes over like a slow, creeping tide. It doesn't arrive with haste, but rather descends with an almost respectful patience, allowing the last glow of dusk to gently give way to full darkness. The family is used to this rhythm. The cold no longer surprises them. It simply returns, as it does every night, as expected and unwelcome as an old injury that flares in the damp. Inside the hut, the fire is low but still alive. It glows faintly in the hearth, pulsing gently like the last heartbeat of the day. Around it, the family settles into their designated places. There is no true bed, not in the modern sense. Instead, a tightly packed layer of straw serves as the base. Over time, this straw darkens with use, dust, and the oils of skin. But it is softened by layers of old cloth, woolen tunics repurposed as blankets, and coarse linen sheets passed down through generations. The coldest nights require proximity. There is no question of personal space or privacy. The father and mother lie on the outside edges, bracing the cold that seeps in through the walls. The children are between them, forming a compact unit of shared heat. The youngest sleeps nestled in the crook of the mother's arm, his breath steady and soft. The older children lie curled like cats, knees pulled to chest, wrapped in every scrap of warmth they can manage. The silence of the night is almost total. No distant roar of carriages or clang of metal work, just the occasional shift of the roof timbers, creaking under the contraction of cold. Sometimes there is the flutter of a bird overhead, the chickens rustling in their perch, or a faint scratching in the thatch where mice search for warmth and crumbs. But mostly there is stillness. In this silence, thoughts drift. For the mother, perhaps memories of her own childhood in a hut just like this one. She remembers the smell of her mother's hair, the weight of the blanket they all shared. Her mother used to hum a quiet tune before sleep. She does not hum now. There is no time for songs, but she remembers. The father lies still, his hands rough and calloused even as they rest. He doesn't dream often anymore. Dreams have been replaced by planning tomorrow's repairs. the weakening beam by the door, the missing piglet from last week. He wonders how long the firewood will last, whether the snow will fall before the thatch can be patched, whether the Lord's tax collector will come early this year. Sleep comes in waves, not a full surrender, but a series of dips and rises. Often one of them stirs to check the fire, to add a piece of wood, to shift a blanket that has fallen. These movements are quiet, automatic, honed by years of repetition. They don't fully wake, they just adjust. Outside, the cold deepens, the ground hardens further. Frost creeps along the edges of the wooden beams and across the glassless window, where a flap of oiled cloth tries to block the wind. The air has a bite to it now, sharp and dry. Breathing feels different, more deliberate. Sometime in the early hours, the fire fades too far. The father, sensing the change in temperature, even in sleep, rises. He does not stretch, or sigh, or pause. He moves directly to the hearth, crouching low. With practiced hands, he rakes the ash to find any hidden ember. If he finds one, he gently feeds it dry moss and shavings from a split branch. If not, he retrieves the ember pot, a small, covered container of ash-wrapped coals, saved precisely for this reason. From this he can revive the fire. He does not use flint and steel if he can avoid it. Those are slow and temperamental in the cold. A saved ember is more reliable. Fire, in this world, is not a tool. It is survival. It is life. The fire returns, and the room warms slightly. The father adds a larger piece of wood and sits for a moment. His back aches, his knees are stiff, but he watches the flames grow, casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. This is the only light he knows in the winter. The sun is distant and pale, but fire is alive. Later, during the second sleep, dreams finally come. The children murmur softly, lost in their own little worlds. The mother, too, slips into deeper rest. This second phase of sleep is said to be richer, more peaceful. And though there is no way for them to know the science of it, they feel it. It is during these hours that the body truly rests. By the time the morning begins to announce itself, a slow, gray light pressing against the eastern horizon, the family begins to stir again. The mother is the first to rise. She always is. Her feet hit the cold floor silently. She moves to the hearth, checking the fire again, preparing water for warmth and food. She places a small pot on the stones, filled with yesterday's broth. A piece of bread is soaked in it to soften. It is not a meal of celebration. It is a meal of function, of necessity. But the children eat it without complaint. Hunger leaves little room for preferences. The father prepares to check the nearby fencing. If a storm comes, the weak spots will give, and the pigs might get loose. The children begin their routine, gathering water, feeding animals, checking on the few supplies they have tucked away in clay jars and woven baskets. A bit of salt, a few dried apples, a few small onions beginning to soften. The day ahead is cold, but it must be faced. They cannot delay. The cold will not wait for them to feel ready. Outside, snow begins to fall, not in a blizzard, but in slow, soft flakes that drift downward like dust. The ground is already hard, but the snow will add slipperiness, conceal dangers, and freeze tools if left out. The children watch it fall for a moment. It is beautiful, in its way, but it also means harder days ahead. Still, the family steps out, one by one, heads covered in wool, hands wrapped in whatever scraps could be tied together, feet sliding into worn shoes. And as they move through the snow, heads bowed slightly, another day begins quiet, cold, and enduring, just as the last one did, just as the next one will. The snow continues to fall throughout the day, light but persistent, forming a thin white sheet over the village paths, the roofs of cottages, the tops of fences. It mutes sound even more than usual, wrapping the world in an eerie stillness. Only the occasional crunch of boots, or the quiet lowing of a cow breaks the silence. The children walk carefully, adjusting their steps to avoid slipping on the newly frozen earth. Inside the hut, time passes slowly. In the dim light, the mother works at spinning wool. It is a labor that requires patience and skill, fingers steady and practiced. The spindle spins with each flick of her hand, twisting the carded wool into thread. This thread will be used to mend clothes, sew sacks, or be woven later into cloth. Every inch matters. Every scrap is valuable. She sits near the fire, not for comfort, but out of necessity. The warmth helps the wool stay pliable and keeps her fingers from stiffening. Near her, the youngest child plays with a carved piece of wood. It's not a toy in the modern sense. It is a smoothed block with a face drawn in charcoal, perhaps once part of a broken tool. Still, in a world of few luxuries, it holds enough magic to entertain a child for hours. The boy presses it into the straw floor, talking softly to it, his words barely audible. The father returns from outside. His face is red from the wind, and snow clings to the folds of his tunic. He brushes himself off before stepping fully into the hut. In his hands, a bundle of withered kindling and a few branches bound with twine. He sets them down beside the firewood pile, already much smaller than it was at the start of the season. He mutters something to the mother, a concern about the snow piling on the roof, perhaps, or a note about the pig enclosure, but doesn't speak loudly. There is no need. Voices are kept low. The day is still long ahead. Outside, the eldest daughter walks toward the shared granary. Not all villages had one, but in this case, the local reeve had allowed it. A communal structure, raised on stilts, where surplus grain is stored. It is locked, of course. Only those with permission may access it. But she is not here to take from the granary. She is meeting another villager, a cousin, or perhaps just a neighbor, to barter. Bartering in winter becomes essential, with coin in short supply and markets often distant or inaccessible due to the snow. Families rely on exchange. Few onions traded for dried mushrooms, a spool of thread for a half-pound of rye. Salt, precious and sometimes scarce, is highly valued. Just a pinch can be worth a bowl of porridge. Today, the daughter carries a small bundle of eggs, wrapped in cloth and straw, still warm from the chickens. She offers them to the neighbor, who in return provides a folded piece of cured leather, useful for repairing shoes. No words are exchanged beyond a few nods. They both understand the value. They both understand the stakes. In the late afternoon, the children gather around the fire. The mother sets to making what will pass as a stew water, bits of root vegetables, the last of the salted pork rind. It simmers slowly, and though it is thin, the smell is welcome. Hunger makes even the plainest foods fragrant. The eldest son sharpens a knife, careful not to lose the edge. He holds the blade at an angle, dragging a stone along it in smooth motions. His hands are steady, despite the cold. A dull knife is dangerous. More pressure is needed to cut, and accidents are common. He has seen what a bad cut can do. Infection, fever, even death. So he sharpens slowly, deliberately, without rushing. As the stew cooks, the family gathers. In silence, they speak little, not because there's nothing to say, but because there is little new to report. The days, especially in winter, blend together. Each one is a quiet contest against the elements, a matter of endurance more than achievement. They share news sparingly. The neighbor's goat gave birth. The reeve inspected the fences. A traveler passed through 2 days ago heading east. Nothing urgent, nothing threatening, just more threads in the tapestry of their isolated lives. When the food is ready, the mother portions it out. Bowls are uneven, carved by hand, with cracks and darkened edges, but they do the job. Each person receives their share, and the room falls quiet again. The fire crackles softly as they eat, heads down, focused on their bowls. Afterward, the mother scrapes the pot clean. The children help tidy up. The eldest daughter begins to sew a tear in her sleeve, using some of the newly spun thread. The father leans back, staring into the fire, eyes half-lidded. The warmth makes the hut almost cozy, at least for now. But outside, the snow thickens. The wind picks up, and the night once again begins to fall. Before sleep, the family prepares, as they always do. The fire is stoked, extra kindling laid close by. The straw bedding is fluffed and shaken. The animals are checked, fed, water broken of ice, pens secured. The chickens are huddled together, feathers puffed, unmoving. The pigs shift in their slumber, occasionally letting out a low grunt. The night air slips through every crack in the hut's frame. The wind whistles past the shutters. Still, the hut holds. It has stood for decades, rebuilt each time a beam rotted or a storm tore it. The roof, it is more than wood and straw. It is memory, effort, endurance. The family gathers once more around the fire before lying down. No one speaks. They simply take their places, as they always have. They press close, body against body, beneath rough blankets, beneath the roof, beneath a sky that stretches endlessly above them, gray, ancient, uncaring. And as they drift into sleep, the snow continues to fall, unhurried and silent, as it always has, and always will. The 6th night of this long winter is not remarkable by any measure. There is no sudden blizzard or howling wind, no crisis that breaks the rhythm of existence. But that, in itself, is what makes it so reflective of the time. The Dark Ages were not defined solely by disasters or battles. More often, they were shaped by repetition, the steady grind of ordinary survival under quiet skies and hard earth. Inside the peasant's home, the routine begins again, just as it always does. After the sun disappears, more of a soft fading of gray than a dramatic descent, the family turns inward. The mother, having spent the day tending to wool, checking dried herbs, and mending garments, now wraps her shoulders in a shawl. It smells of smoke and lye soap, worn down by years of use. She moves slowly, her body sore from crouching too long by the hearth. The father sits near the fire, sharpening an old wooden tool. It's a rudimentary hoe, the handle cracked but serviceable. Though the ground is frozen now, he prepares it for the coming spring. Preparation is survival. When the frost lifts, the planting must begin without delay, or the yield will be too small to last the next winter. He sands the wood gently, not for aesthetics but to smooth the handle against future blisters. The children have begun to lose track of days. There are no calendars in this home, no written record to track the turning of the year. They rely on changes in the light, the feel of the air, and the shifting behavior of animals. The chickens, restless lately, have started to lay fewer eggs. The pigs grunt louder at night, sensing something in the cold, perhaps the approach of more snow. Tonight, the youngest child is unwell. His forehead is warm, and his cheeks flushed. The mother notices it immediately, placing her hand against his skin with quiet concern. There are no doctors, not here, not in a world where knowledge is a patchwork of superstition, herbal memory, and hearsay. She reaches for a cloth soaked in cool water, and presses it to his brow. Then she gathers a few dried leaves from a pouch, yarrow, perhaps, or elderflower, and places them in a cup with warm water. The mixture is bitter, but the child drinks obediently, eyes heavy. Sickness in winter is feared more than wolves. A single fever can spread through a home like fire. There is no medicine beyond what the land and tradition provide. No certainty of recovery. The mother stays close to the boy, placing more wood on the fire to raise the heat. Warmth is medicine. To Dot, the rest of the family speaks in whispers. They move gently around the room, their faces carved with concern but no panic. Panic has no place here, only patience, hope, and quiet resolve. As the hours pass, the boy falls into a deeper sleep. His breathing evens. The flesh on his cheeks dulls a little. The mother exhales, still wary but a touch more hopeful. She does not sleep that night. She remains seated, holding the boy's hand, listening to the faint sounds of his breath and the fire. The night outside is cold, but calmer than the last. The wind is still, allowing frost to settle quietly on every surface. The branches, the fences, the thatch roof, the edges of the wooden door. The stars above are faint and blurred, veiled by thin clouds that roll over the sky like slow-moving tides. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then is silent. Inside, the air is warm, but stale. The fire burns through the remaining kindling faster than expected. The father wakes several times during the night to fetch more from the pile. Now significantly reduced, he will need to take the axe out again soon and break apart more frozen branches, or barter for logs with someone closer to the forest's edge. Trees, after all, are property too, and cutting the Lord's wood without permission could bring fines or worse. The days of free forests are long gone. Every resource is owned. every action accounted for. Near dawn, the mother finally dozes off, still sitting upright, the child curled against her. The others are asleep, their forms barely moving under the pile of rough cloth and straw. In this brief hour of stillness, a strange peace fills the room, not joy, but something closer to gratitude. Gratitude for another day survived, another fever cooled, another fire that didn't go out. When the morning comes, it is slow and uncertain. The sun does not rise so much as appear, dim, veiled, distant. The frost clings stubbornly to the windowsill. The chickens stir quietly in their enclosure. The pigs snort, impatient for food. The cow shifts her weight, her breath visible in the frigid air. The father steps out first. He wears a wool cap pulled low, and his breath escapes in clouds. He checks the animals, knocking ice from the trough, spreading out what feed remains. The cow's milk has lessened, as expected, but she is still giving enough to mix into the porridge. A small mercy. The eldest daughter tends to the hearth, feeding it with the last few bits of dry wood. She watches the flame carefully, coaxing it into strength. Without this flame, the day cannot begin. There is no warm food, no boiled water, no heated air to push back the frozen world beyond the door. The fire is not symbolic here, it is essential. Inside, the boy awakens, his fever has not returned, his eyes are clearer. He asks for something to eat, his voice hoarse but familiar. The mother smiles, faint and tired. She tears a piece of bread and softens it in the warm broth left over from the night before. The meal is small but nourishing, and so the day begins. Another repetition, another step forward into the long season. This is how life proceeds in the Dark Ages, not in grand gestures or defining moments, but in the rhythm of care, of attention, of quiet resistance to the cold. They do not seek to conquer winter, only to outlast it, to move through it one breath at a time, one night at a time, as they eat together, each one holding a rough wooden bowl and warming their hands by the fire. The snow begins to fall again, and no one says a word, because there is nothing new to say. They already know what the snow means, they always have. The seventh day of the deep winter begins with stillness. Not the calm kind, but a kind that feels heavy, like the air itself is pressed down by the weight of snow and time. Outside, the sky is pale and colorless, like washed linen left too long in the rain. The sounds of the village are muffled. No birds sing, no carts creak, and even the dogs seem to understand that today is not a day for noise. Inside the peasant's hut, the morning routine unfolds as it always does, though slower than before. The fire burned low during the night and must be revived from ash. A few stubborn embers remain, glowing faintly like watchful eyes in the dark. The eldest son crouches by the hearth, blowing gently, feeding dry straw and kindling to coax the flames back to life. His breath forms little clouds with each exhale. It takes time, but eventually, the orange light returns, casting shadows along the walls. The hut smells of smoke and boiled grain. Breakfast is a thin gruel made from oats. Bland, but warm, and most importantly, filling. The children eat without complaint. Hunger has become familiar now, no longer a sharp sensation, but a constant background hum, like the wind against the walls. Today, the father has a task, one that cannot wait. The snow on the roof has grown too heavy. If left unchecked, it could collapse the thatch, especially where the wood has begun to rot near the eaves. Armed with a long pole, he climbs onto a crude stool and begins carefully dislodging the snow. Each push sends a heavy, powdery sheet sliding down to the ground, where it falls with a soft thud. He works silently, his breath steady, hands red from the cold. Below, the mother watches him from the doorway. She holds a rag around her hands for warmth, and keeps an eye on the youngest child, who toddles just inside. Her gaze is wary. A slip, a fall, a bad angle, any of these could mean disaster in a world without doctors. Every movement matters. When the task is done, the father descends carefully, brushing snow from his shoulders. He nods once to the mother and returns inside. His boots are soaked, his tunic damp. He removes the outer layers and hangs them near the fire to dry. Steam rises slowly from the wool, the scent of snow and sweat filling the small room. Later, the family turns to maintenance work. The long hours of winter are not idle, not if they hope to survive. Clothing must be mended, tools repaired, nets untangled. The eldest daughter weaves new cords from hemp, her fingers moving with practiced ease. Beside her, the younger children help sort dried beans from last autumn's harvest, removing any spoiled ones with quiet diligence. The mother tends to herbs and dried flowers hanging from the rafters. These are her pharmacy gathered during warmer months, stored carefully, used sparingly. She crumbles a bit of dried mint into a pouch, sets aside some crushed nettle leaves, and checks the dwindling supply of garlic. There is comfort in this ritual. The scents remind her of summer, of green fields and buzzing insects, things that feel impossibly distant now. Outside, the village remains subdued. A few figures move in the distance, neighbors tending to animals, fetching water from the frozen stream, checking the integrity of fences. No one lingers. The cold bites harder with each passing day, and every step outside feels like a negotiation with winter itself. By afternoon, the clouds thicken again. The sky darkens prematurely, and a new snowfall begins. This one is heavier, thicker. The flakes fall like feathers, swirling in the air, gathering along doorframes and windowsills. Inside the hut, the family prepares for another long night. The remaining firewood is counted, a routine that has become more desperate in recent days. There is enough for tonight, maybe tomorrow, too. But after that, someone will need to go further afield, into the woods, into the edges of the manor's land, where collecting fallen branches carries risk, not just from the cold or wild animals, but from being caught by the reeve or one of the Lord's men. Trespassing, even for firewood, is punishable, but freezing is just as final. The evening meal is modest. A bit of barley porridge, some dried apple slices, a sliver of preserved meat. They eat slowly, savoring each bite. The youngest child giggles once, amused by the flickering shadows cast by the fire. His laughter is soft but contagious, and for a moment, even the father smiles. When the bowls are cleaned and the hearth stoked for the night, the family prepares for sleep. They do so without ceremony. No prayers are said aloud, though perhaps some are whispered silently, small hopes breathed into the darkness. They lie close together, as always. The cold seeps through the walls, but their combined warmth holds it at bay. The firelight fades, flickering lower and lower until only a red glow remains. And in that dim light, with the snow falling heavier now than ever, the hut becomes a cocoon of quiet persistence. Outside, the village sleeps. The trees bow beneath the weight of winter, and the night stretches long and silent across the land. The 8th night of winter arrives, not with a storm or sudden chill, but with a certain kind of quiet that even the most hardened peasant notices. The air is still and naturally zoned. The snow on the ground has become a thick, heavy blanket that absorbs sound. There are no birds, no distant creak of carts, no bark from dogs. It is as if the world has been muted by the season itself, as if the cold has numbed even the very breath of the land. Inside the cottage, the fire is smaller tonight. The woodpile has grown low. The father knows this and has not said anything, but the silence in his movements gives it away. He rationed the logs today, careful to burn only what was necessary to cook and warm. Tomorrow, he will have to go farther, deeper into the edge of the forest, where the trees are thicker but the danger greater. The forest is not just trees and quiet. In winter, it is a place where wolves walk freely. Hunger drives them closer to the village. A lone man, burdened with firewood, is an easy target. Still, the fire must be fed, and the family must stay warm. So, as always, the risk will be taken, and the hope is that the wolves are hunting elsewhere. The children do not know the specifics. They are told only that Papa will be gone longer tomorrow, and that they must stay close to the hearth. The eldest daughter, wise beyond her years, understands the implication. She watches her father that night with more attention than usual, noting how he sharpens the iron axe and checks the leather bindings on his old boots. The mother prepares what little she can in advance. She sets aside a scrap of salted meat, the size of a hand, and a heel of bread for his journey. She wraps it in cloth, tying the corners gently. These gestures are small, but heavy with emotion. In this time, love is shown not through words, but through acts of quiet provision. Night falls early, again. The snow outside glows faintly in the moonlight, casting a pale silver light through the gaps in the shutters. Inside, the glow of the fire flickers softly against the wooden walls. The smoke from the hearth curls upward, sweet and bitter, scented faintly with ash and meat fat. The family eats together, as always. The meal is thinner tonight, mostly broth with a few root vegetables floating in it. The flavor is mild, but the warmth is what they seek. Each bowl is cradled carefully, hands wrapped around the wood as if to absorb every bit of heat. Afterward, the family does not scatter. There is nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. So they sit together in the shared silence of a winter night. The father oils the axe, the mother darns a worn sock. The children lie near the hearth, watching the flames dance in patterns that flicker across their tired faces. Stories are sometimes told in these moments-old tales, handed down from elder to child, shaped by time and the teller's memory. But tonight, there are no stories, only the crackle of the fire and the occasional pop of burning resin. The silence is not somber, it is simply part of the rhythm of their life. There is comfort in repetition, in knowing what comes next, even if what comes next is just another cold night. As the youngest begins to nod off, the mother lifts him gently and lays him down among the layered blankets and rough spun cloths. He nestles in beside his sister, his tiny feet still cold. She pulls a woolen wrap over them, tucking it under with practiced care. The rest of the family follows not long after. Sleep comes early in winter, not just from fatigue but from the darkness itself. With no light beyond the fire and no tasks left for the day, there is no reason to remain awake. They lie close, sharing breath and body warmth beneath layers of wool, fur, and worn linen. It is not comfortable by modern standards, but in this world, it is what safety feels like. Outside, the snow thickens. The world beyond the door vanishes into a white hush, where even the trees seem buried in silence. A fox crosses the edge of the village, nose low to the ground, moving swiftly and without pause. Its prints will be gone by morning, erased by the night's steady fall. Within the hut, the fire dies slowly. Embers glow faintly in the dark, fading to orange, then red. The room cools with each passing hour, but the family remains warm, insulated by the closeness of each other and the thickness of tradition. This is not a night of drama or danger, but one of steady endurance, and that, more than anything, defines the reality of winter in the Dark Ages. Nights did not always roar, they often whispered. They passed slowly, quietly, and without fanfare, one after another, until the frost finally lifted and the earth turned soft again. But for now, the frost remains, and the snow continues to fall. Tomorrow will be colder, but tonight they sleep, and that is enough. The 9th morning arrives before the light does. In the darkest part of the day, just before the sky begins its slow transition from black to ash gray, the father is already awake. He lies still for a moment, listening. The wind outside is calm. The wood walls creak faintly as they settle from the cold. He knows this is the best time to move, before the snow softens, before the sun rises and exposes his path through the frost. He sits up slowly, careful not to wake the others. His joints ache, not from injury but from time and cold. Pain is not something to be commented on in this life, it simply is. Like the wind, like the snow, like hunger. He pulls on his wool tunic, patched at the elbows, and wraps his feet with dry cloth before slipping into the stiff leather boots left near the fire the night before. His wife stirs briefly. She doesn't speak, but her eyes meet his in the dim light, and they share a glance that carries everything: caution, hope, worry, trust. She presses the small bundle of food into his hand: bread, meat, and a strip of dried apple. He nods and steps into the cold. The snow crunches under his weight, still fresh from the night's fall. The air is sharp and dry, and his breath leaves long trails in the dim. He carries the axe on his shoulder, the blade wrapped in cloth to avoid the bite of frostbite should it rest against bare skin. He passes the silent pens of the animals, their breaths visible in the half-light, and then he leaves the edge of the village, following a narrow path into the woods. The forest is a cathedral of white. The trees rise tall and bare, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks like frozen sentinels. Every step is measured, every sound carries. A bird flutters from a branch overhead, but otherwise the world is still. He knows these paths. He's walked them since he was a boy, learning where the fallen trees lie, where the dry wood gathers, where the frost runs thickest. But even familiarity does not breed safety. In winter, the forest can turn on a man without warning. A sudden crack of ice, a hidden den of wolves, a tree limb breaking overhead under the weight of snow. He keeps his eyes down, his ears open. Meanwhile, back at the hut, the day begins. Slowly the eldest daughter lights the hearth, feeding it patiently until warmth spreads. The younger children remain under the blankets, too cold to rise, their breaths forming small clouds in the chill air. The mother stirs the morning meal, the same oat gruel as most days, and listens for any sounds of return from the forest path. She does not expect him soon. The Goodwood lies far beyond the village now, closer to the hills, and he will not return until his arms are full and his back weary. But still, every so often, she looks toward the door, drawn by instinct more than hope. The hours pass slowly in the forest. The father finds what he came for, a fallen birch, dry and stripped of bark, half covered in snow. He clears it with the axe, testing the wood with a few careful swings. It cracks. Well, not wet. Good. He begins the work, rhythm steady, blade rising and falling in slow arcs, snow flying with each strike. The sound echoes softly, swallowed quickly by the trees. He works until his breath comes hard and his hands throb. Then he bundles the split wood, ties it with a rope around his shoulders, and begins the walk back. His pace is slower now, burdened, and the snow seems deeper on the return. But he does not stop. The cold is not forgiving. By mid-afternoon the children begin to grow restless. The hut is warm now, the fire bright. The eldest reads aloud from a scrap of old parchment kept tucked in a wooden box, a prayer or a fable, the meaning half to time. It is not for entertainment, but for rhythm. Words, even when their meaning is faint, can hold shape in a home. The voice brings calm. The youngest asks about the snow. Will it stop? He says. The mother answers gently, eventually. There is no promise in her voice, but neither is there fear. Snow is a guest who overstays but eventually leaves. Always. Near sunset, the door opens. A gust of wind enters first, then the father, hunched in white with frost. He carries the bundle of wood across his shoulders, his cheeks red and beard frozen stiff. The mother helps him with the rope, and together they stack the wood by the hearth, each piece placed carefully, as though it were treasure. He does not speak much, only it was clear, and I saw no tracks. Enough to reassure, enough to let them know there is no immediate danger in the woods. He eats slowly that night, more tired than hungry. But his presence is its own kind of nourishment. That evening, the fire burns higher. The new wood catches quickly, and the warmth spreads through the small home. For the first time in days, there is enough to not ration, enough to sit by the fire a little longer, enough to dry the damp linens and warm the boots properly, enough to breathe deeper as night falls. The snow eases. The wind is quiet, the sky lighter with moon and cloud. Inside, the children sleep easier. The mother wraps herself in her shawl and rests her head beside the youngest child. The father sits a while longer by the fire, watching the flames. His hands are raw, and his back aches. But he says nothing of it. These are not days of triumph or joy. They are days of endurance, of small victories. A fire brought home from the edge of the world. And tonight, for the first time in many nights, the fire does not sputter before sleep. It burns on, steady and low, a quiet heartbeat in the middle of the cold. Outside, the snow falls softer. Inside, they rest, and for now, that is enough. There are nights when time feels suspended, when the dark stretches endlessly and the mind forgets what warmth truly feels like. The 10th night of this bitter winter is one such time. Outside the cottage, the snow lies undisturbed, thick as wool, blanketing the village with an eerie quietness that muffles even the creaking of old wood, and the occasional animal's breath. The stars above are hidden behind a sky of unbroken gray. And the moon, if it exists tonight, is cloaked. Inside, the fire remains steady. Not bright, not bold, but alive, and that is enough. The wood gathered the previous day has brought comfort. Its steady crackle offers a rhythm to the silence, and in this small, low-ceilinged space, the warmth makes the difference between sleep and waking cold. The children lie pressed together near the hearth, a tangle of limbs beneath layers of linen and fur. Their breath rises softly, one after the other, in tiny puffs that vanish into the dimness. They do not dream of spring. In this world, spring is too far away to be believed in during nights like this. They dream only of waking to a fire still burning. The father has woken early again, though it is still pitch black. Something stirred him, perhaps the wind outside shifting through the shutters, or the cold creeping into his bones. He sits on the edge of the straw mattress, his breath misting in the air, and listens. The world is quiet, utterly quiet. He adds another log to the fire. It hisses slightly, snow still clinging to its bark. Sparks rise for a moment before dying, and then the flames grow again, stretching upward with lazy flickers. This morning, he does not venture out. His body has not recovered from the last trip. His hands are cracked and raw at the knuckles, and the muscle along his lower back has stiffened into pain. Today, he will stay close. Instead, he sharpens the family's tools. The small sickle for cutting thatch, the carving knife used in the kitchen, the metal hook for fishing that will not be used again until the thaw. The stone slides slowly over the edges, a rasping sound, rhythmic, calming. The mother spends the morning sorting what little remains of the dried vegetables. Some carrots have shriveled past usefulness, but there are still a few good ones. A turnip, to onions, and a small pouch of parsnip slivers remain. She sets them aside carefully, not for today's meal, but for a thicker stew tomorrow, if the weather holds and they can retrieve more water from the creek. Water has become a task in itself. The bucket must be carried down the frozen path, then through snowdrifts toward the stream, where ice must be broken anew each day. Yesterday, the eldest daughter made the trip. Today, it may be the mother's turn. The father has done enough. The creek is near, but the walk there and back feels like a pilgrimage. Each step is made with caution. The snow covers all hazards. Frozen puddles, brittle twigs, uneven stones. The bucket, once filled, is heavier than it should be, and its metal handle burns cold through even thick gloves. But it is water, and water is life. When she returns, cheeks red and wet hair frozen in strands, she is met with quiet gratitude. The fire is still going. The hut smells of wood and wool. The children stir and sit up, rubbing eyes and stretching thin arms. The eldest boy tends to the small goat outside, giving it straw and checking its hooves for signs of frost. The animal is quieter now, moving slowly, but still alive. A mercy midday brings a small meal, nothing rich, just bread softened with hot water and a spoon of pickled cabbage from a jar saved for such lean days. The taste is sour, the texture soft, but it is something. The youngest child makes a face but eats regardless. Conversation is rare. What is there to say? The cold continues. The snow continues. There is no news from the manor. No peddlers. No visitors. Only the wind and the smoke from the chimney that coils into the low sky. By afternoon, the father gathers his strength, not to walk far, but to step outside. He checks the roof again, brushing loose snow from the low edge. He tightens the binding on the door where it sags and lets in drafts. He checks the small pen where the chickens were kept before the frost. There are no more chickens now, but the structure still stands, and it may one day be needed again. Such maintenance feels pointless to some, but to a peasant, it is a kind of hope. A broken pen implies nothing will ever need keeping again. A repaired one means that, perhaps, there will be chickens again. Eggs, spring, life. Evening comes early. The sun is not seen, but sensed a dim shift in the light behind the clouds. Inside, preparations begin for nightfall once more. The fire is fed again. The blankets are fluffed and shaken. The straw bed turned over. The hut is swept not because there is any real filth, but because a clean space is easier to endure than a dirty one. Even in survival, there is room for dignity tonight. The father tells a story. He speaks slowly, voice low, of a fox that tricked a bear in winter. stealing its fish by pretending to have caught them with its own tail in the ice. The children giggle, the older ones rolling their eyes at the old tale they've heard before. But still, they listen. The youngest repeats the part about the fox's tail freezing, and the room fills briefly with the quiet echo of laughter. Laughter is rare in winter. It does not last long, but it lingers like the warmth from the fire. When sleep comes, it comes quickly. The room grows darker as the flames sink low. Embers pulse gently in the hearth, like the last breaths of a living creature. The snow outside shows no sign of melting. The trees bend, but do not break. The roofs groan, but remain standing. The frost creeps, but has not one dot, and beneath it all, in huts like this one, peasants sleep, limbs entangled, dreams buried. Deep, the dark is long, the cold is longer, but they are still here, still breathing, still warm. The 11th night came with silence, the kind that settles over the land like a blanket of lead. It was the silence of deep cold, when even the trees stop creaking and no bird dares to cry out. The snow outside had thickened overnight, rising past the knees of those who dared to walk it, and pressing itself against the doors of the peasant huts like an unwanted guest. The world had gone still, not by peace, but by surrender. Inside the family's cottage, breath rose in plumes above the bundled bodies, and even the fire seemed to burn more softly, as if whispering in deference to the heaviness of the night. The father was awake before anyone else. He often was, not out of obligation, but out of habit, a silent rhythm, carved into his life by years of surviving winters that did not forgive lateness. He did not move right away. He watched the shadows shift across the wall, firelight playing tricks with the contours of wood grain and woven cloth. He listened to the fire's gentle crackle, the faint rustle of one of the children turning beneath a fir. For a few moments, he simply existed in the warmth. Then, without a word, he stood. Each day had its rhythm, and the rhythm did not change, not even after 11 nights of relentless cold. The first duty was the fire. He examined the coals, prodded them with a stick, placed a few new pieces of wood on top, carefully, preserving the better pieces for when the weather turned even worse. He could tell by the air, worse was coming. There was a certain clarity in the cold, a way the wind shifted direction or the frost gathered in thicker crystals around the inside of the shutters. You could hear it in how the trees groaned, see it in how the smoke from the chimney didn't drift, but clung to the rooftop like fog. It meant a blizzard was forming. His wife stirred next, her eyes heavy but aware. They exchanged only the smallest nod. She rose slowly and pulled a shawl around her shoulders before stepping outside to check the state of the snow, to feel the air on her skin, to gauge how long they had before white skies turned white ground into indistinguishable horizon. The eldest children began to wake. Their bodies had adjusted to the new normal. Stiff limbs, aching shoulders, the dull sting of sleeping on straw that never dried fully. They did not complain. In this life, complaint was a waste of warmth. Instead, they busied themselves with quiet tasks, checking the state of the stored vegetables, shaking snow from the hanging cloths, checking the integrity of the door. Breakfast was thin, it had to be. A piece of hard bread each, dipped into water warmed with a sliver of fat. It did not fill their stomachs, but it softened the ache of emptiness. The youngest child, still too small to know the difference between enough and not enough, asked if there might be berries. The mother only smiled and said, "Not today." Later that morning a visitor came. It was not a guest in the usual sense. It was the steward from the Lord's manor, a tall, pale man with a cloak of thick wool, and gloves finer than any this household would ever own. His horse stood at the edge of the village, its breath fogging in the air, while he stepped carefully through the snow to make his rounds. Each family received a similar message. The Lord would be expecting the first of the new season's tides. As soon as the roads cleared, grain, eggs, wood, cloth, it did not matter that the fields were frozen and the hens dead or sleeping. Obligation did not thaw with winter. When the steward left, he took nothing, but his presence alone was heavy. The family watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse and continued on, vanishing into the white mist beyond the trees. The father said nothing at first. He simply sat beside the fire, slowly sharpening the blade of the axe, not for rebellion, Not for violence, but because tools must be kept ready, especially in a season where everything works against survival. The axe was their lifeline. To wood, to warmth, to safety. By afternoon, the sky had changed. The clouds had thickened into something tangible, pressing down on the world like a great wool blanket. Snow began to fall again, slow at first, like lazy ash drifting from a far-off fire, and then faster, thicker, more determined. The family knew what to do. The shutters were sealed tight. Extra furs were hung over the doorway. The fire was stoked again, fed even though it meant using wood that had been set aside. The animals, what few remained, were checked one last time, and then they too were sealed into the small lean-to barn with extra straw and silence. Then inside, the light faded. Day and night lost meaning in a world where the sun could not pierce. The sky, the interior of the hut, became a world unto itself, cut off from the storm beyond. The fire glowed in the center like a sun, casting long shadows, warming bones, holding off despair. That night there was singing, not a performance, not even really a song, just a quiet hum, started by the mother as she stirred a thin broth, then picked up by the children as they lay beneath the shared furs. It was a tune passed down by her own mother, who had lived through winters like this, and her mother before her. No one remembered the words anymore. They had been lost in time, like so much else, but the melody remained. It was a tune of stillness, of surviving without the promise of comfort. A tune that hummed like the wind between trees, like the flicker of flame on stone, like the sound of bare hands brushing frost from wood. The children's eyes grew heavy beneath that melody. One by one they drifted into sleep, their faces soft, their hands relaxed. The parents remained awake a little longer. They always did. The mother watched the fire. The father sat sharpening the last of the tools. Outside, the blizzard gathered in strength. Snow fell sideways now, whipped by wind that howled like wolves, battering the edges of the hut, seeking weakness. But the walls held, and the fire held, and the family, together in the quiet dark, held too, for another night, for another storm, for another day to come. The 12th night began not with darkness, but with light, strangely, softly, eerily pale light. It filtered through the snow-caked window slats and cast the interior of the hut in a cold bluish hue. The storm had passed sometime in the deep. Hours before dawn, leaving behind a silence so absolute it seemed unnatural, as if the world had been placed under a thick sheet and told to hold its breath. The father was already awake, having stirred many times through the night to check the fire, to listen for cracks in the wood beams, to feel for drafts. Survival in this season depended on vigilance, on not sleeping too deeply, on listening even when there was nothing to hear. Now he sat near the hearth, feeding the dying embers with small pieces of dried twig and bark, the last of the easy kindling. The room around him stirred slowly. The mother rose and moved with care, wrapping herself in wool and placing a pot over the flame. No words were exchanged. There was no need. They had lived too many winters to require chatter in the early hours. The work spoke for itself. Outside, the snow had transformed the village. Roofs looked as though they were buried under thick white cloaks. The paths between homes were gone, erased completely. Trees sagged under the weight of the storm's gift, their branches hanging low and brittle. It was beautiful in its way, but it was the kind of beauty peasants feared, because it often came before hardship. The children woke one by one. The youngest, ever curious, asked if the snow would reach the roof, and if they would be buried like potatoes in a root cellar. The mother smiled faintly and said that if they were, they'd be the warmest potatoes in the land. That day was not for venturing out. The father tried, briefly, pushing against the cottage door, until the snow gave way enough to open a narrow path. The cold hit his face like a slap, sharp and dry, the kind of cold that burned instead of bit. He went no farther than the edge of the roof, where he knocked off some of the weight with a stick, listening for any troubling groans in the timbers. Satisfied that nothing was about to collapse, he stepped back inside and bolted the door shut. Once more, indoors, the day passed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of winter life. The children played with dried twigs fashioned into dolls. The older ones stitched small patches into their wool tunics, making sure their garments would last a few more weeks. The mother made broth again, thin but warm, flavored with nothing more than the memory of onion and the salt left behind at the bottom of a small ceramic jar. The father tended to the animal Liantu. Though there was no livestock left to fuss over, he took time to check the structure for leaks or signs of strain. An old habit from better years, when they had kept pigs and geese and the winter meant rationing feed instead of wondering how to stretch the last of their dried legumes into another meal. Later in the day, the eldest daughter found a single candle stub in a wooden box near the hearth. It had been overlooked, likely tucked away during a time of plenty. Its wax was yellowed and slightly cracked, but the wick was intact. They lit it with reverence. The warm light gave the room a new color, golden instead of gray, and for a time, it made the space feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The family gathered close around it, sharing what stories they remembered, the children's tales were mostly fanciful, of animals that talked, of kings who befriended dragons, of mountains made of honey. The father, in a rare moment, shared a story from his youth, a memory of a winter much like this one, when his own father had walked a full day to barter for a single jar of dried berries. They had eaten them slowly, one per evening, savoring each as if it were treasure. The children listened quietly, absorbing the story not just for the words but for the tone. The way their father's voice softened when he spoke of hunger and hope in the same breath. As night fell, the candle burned low. Its flicker danced across their faces as the wind outside picked up again, not a storm this time, but a cold breath moving through the branches like a whispered warning. The fire was still going, but wood was becoming scarce. The father knew he would have to risk a trip into the woods soon, storm or not. But not tonight. Tonight was about conserving strength. They gathered together under their shared coverings, closer than usual. The candle guttered once, then twice, before vanishing into a thin wisp of smoke. Darkness reclaimed the room. The only light now came from the fire's slow breathing, and yet, despite the stillness, despite the cold creeping along the floor, there was a sense of peace. The children were warm, the roof held, and the storm had passed. One more day survived. In the deepest hours of night, when the coals glowed like red eyes in the hearth, the mother whispered a lullaby. It was quiet, nearly inaudible beneath the wind's moan, and no one stirred in reply. But it wove its way into their sleep, into the walls, into the long history of nights survived, because in the dark ages, survival itself was a lullaby, persistent, full of memory and patience. The night stretched on, and they slept together, still here, still holding on. Morning did not come with the sun. In the depth of winter, light was often a rumor, a gradual graying of the sky that whispered more than it shone. On the 13th day of relentless cold, it arrived like a faint promise, the kind of light that didn't bring warmth but offered just enough vision to begin the daily rituals again. And in the dark ages, that was more than enough. The family rose slowly. Bones, stiff, eyes dry from the smoke of the night fire, minds still wrapped in dreams of warmer seasons that felt centuries away. The fire had burned low again, but coals still smoldered, flickering red beneath the ash like memories, refusing to die. The father stirred them with a stick, methodically adding splinters and twigs gathered days ago from beneath the lean ash to dot. No one spoke at first. Words were saved for necessity. They used them sparingly in winter, like food, like firewood, like energy. The day's first task was simple but essential. Melt snow. The clay pot was filled with tightly packed snow scooped from just outside the door. It sat near the hearth, slowly turning to water, then to steam, as the family began the day's quiet labor. The melted water would serve for everything: drinking, cleaning, even warming hands if a few drops were allowed to steam in a bowl. Outside, the world was entombed. The snow had not melted in days. It had merely shifted, repacked by wind, shaped by the weight of passing animals, settled into layers that mapped the storm's history. Trees stood like frozen sentinels, cloaked in white, unmoving and patient. Even birds were absent now. Their silence was a warning. The eldest son ventured out for wood. It was his turn. He wore a hood stitched with rabbit fur, boots soled with rough leather, hands wrapped in cloth. He moved slowly through the drift, careful to follow the narrow path carved from previous trips. The woodpile had diminished alarmingly, but it was still standing, just enough to avoid the dangerous task of felling fresh branches from trees thick with ice. Back inside, the mother boiled what remained of the dried lentils. She added a sliver of smoked turnip from a small cloth bundle, slicing it with care. The aroma was mild but comforting. The children hovered nearby, each pretending not to watch the pot too closely, though hunger shaped the angles of their faces. More each day. That afternoon, the snow began to fall again, this time gently, with white flakes that moved slowly, like ash descending from a distant fire. The wind was absent, replaced by a silence so deep it pressed against the ears. Even the youngest children grew quiet, sensing something ancient in the stillness. The family gathered around the fire. The eldest daughter, with thread and bone needle, worked at patching a worn cloak. The mother spun a small bundle of flax fibers into coarse string. The youngest traced shapes into the dirt floor with a stick, spirals, stars. What might have been letters had they ever learned to write? Their world was made of textures: the coarseness of wool, the slick sheen of melting snow, the sharp edge of splinters, the softness of each other's breath. Everything in the cottage was humble, but everything was useful. There was no room for waste. Even cracked clay pots were repurposed into storage. Bowls or candle stands, broken wooden spoons became toys. Ashes were saved for cleaning. Late in the day, the father returned from the barn with a discovery: 2 small potatoes, missed during the last harvest and half frozen, but edible. The children's eyes widened. Potatoes meant something warm, something substantial. The mother, smiling despite herself, roasted them in the fire's edge. Watching carefully to prevent burning, they ate them in silence, sharing equally, even scraping the skins. The warmth of the food lingered on their tongues, filling more than their stomachs. In a world governed by scarcity, such moments were victories. No one said as much, there was no need to name it. They simply sat closer together, letting the heat of the meal settle into their bones. As night fell, the wind returned. It arrived with a sigh and then a growl, pressing its body against the cottage walls, curling around the edges of the roof. Slipping beneath the doorframe, the fire was fed again. Another log sacrificed. The father murmured a quiet apology to the dwindling pile of wood. They prepared for sleep. The children were wrapped in shared coverings again: wool, fur, straw, whatever could trap the warmth between their bodies. The parents watched over them for a while, speaking softly to each other in the language of glances. Every evening brought a silent inventory: fire stable, walls strong, food enough, family whole. Before sleep, the mother told a story. It was not about knights or castles, but about an old woman who had once tamed the winter by singing to the snow. The children listened with wide eyes. They knew better than to believe in magic, but belief was not the same as hope. And hope, even in the dark ages, was the only thing brighter than firelight. The tale drifted to an end. The wind howled outside. The fire crackled softly, and one by one, they fell asleep again, warm against each other, floating in the darkness, wrapped in silence, alive in a season meant to erase the week. Another night survived. Another line in the long, quiet history of those who endured. The 14th morning broke not with sound, but with a dull ache in the joints and a stiffness in the limbs. Sleep had come in patches, light, interrupted, and filled with the kind of dreams that were more memory than imagination. The cold had deepened in the night, sinking beneath even the wool and straw, curling into fingers and toes, coiling around the spine. It was the kind of cold that didn't scream, but whispered slowly into the bones: I am here, and I will stay. The fire had burned low again, leaving only embers. The father, already up before the light returned, leaned over the hearth and gently blew on the coals. A practiced breath, slow and steady, just enough to tease the glow into something more alive. He added a handful of dried moss and twigs, the last of the smallest kindling. It caught slowly, reluctantly, and finally, the room began to warm with light rather than heat. The mother stirred next. Her hands moved mechanically, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders, reaching for the water pot to check if it had frozen. It had a thin skin of ice had formed across its surface, and she cracked it with the back of a wooden spoon. She set the pot near the edge of the fire, where it would thaw slowly. Outside, nothing had changed. Or rather, everything had changed. In the same way again, snow blanketed the world as it had the day before and the day before that. It was now higher than the tops of boots, deeper than the legs of chickens if there had been chickens. The sky above was gray and unmoving, a lid pressed tight over the land. The children woke, shivering but quiet. They no longer asked what day it was. The concept of days had stretched into a season, an unending period of sameness, where time moved by the fire's rise and fall, by the shrinking pile of wood, by the softening of root vegetables, by the increasing silence of the surrounding forest. Breakfast was a crust of bread, sliced thin. It had gone hard days ago, and the mother soaked it briefly in warm water to soften it. A pinch of salt, carefully rationed, gave it just enough taste to be something more than paste. The children chewed slowly, savoring even the blandness, knowing nothing sweeter would come that day. That afternoon, the eldest daughter mended socks by the fire. She used long looping stitches of thick wool thread, coarse and rough but warm. Each pair took nearly an hour to fix, and she worked by the window, where the faint light helped guide her needle. She didn't complain. Hands busy meant mind distracted. The father ventured out again, this time with a shovel fashioned from a piece of wood and iron. He carved a path to the old latrine and back, then shoveled the roof of the animal shelter, worried that the snow might grow heavy enough to collapse it. Even though the shelter was mostly empty, now only a single goat remained. Old and stubborn, it was worth preserving. If the roof caved in, they'd have to burn it for firewood, and then it would be gone. The sun, such as it was, began to sink by minute. In winter, daylight felt like a blink, just enough to see the path, never enough to follow it. The father came back with a small bundle of frozen sticks, and the beginnings of frostbite on 2 fingers. The mother scolded him without words, wrapping his hands in wool and sitting him near the hearth. He nodded and accepted it. There was no argument in survival. That evening, the family gathered close again. The children played a quiet game, tapping pebbles against a drawn circle on the dirt floor, pretending they were merchants trading stones for gold. The youngest invented the rules as they went. No one corrected them. In the cold of the Dark Ages, imagination was a shelter of its own. The mother hummed softly while darning a sleeve. Her song had no words, just a tune passed down from her own mother, who had likely heard it from hers. It had survived the centuries, not because it was important, but because it was soothing. Some things live on for no reason other than the comfort they offer. Dinner was a stew of boiled turnip peelings, and a bit of dried sage. The smell was more flavorful than the taste, but the heat was welcome. The father ladled it evenly between bowls, making sure the youngest had enough. When the bowls were scraped clean, he turned to the window and listened for the wind. It had quieted, the snow still fell, but softly now. A gentle, persistent whisper against the glass. Before sleep, the mother told another story. This one was about a village that had disappeared in a single winter, swallowed by snow, forgotten by the outside world, and remembered only in songs. The children listened with wide eyes. The older ones knew such stories were not just myths. Whole communities had vanished like that. Cold was not just a season, it was a hunter, and it hunted the quiet, the unprepared, the unlucky. But tonight they were still here. They curled together again, tighter than before. The coverings were growing thin. The fire needed more fuel than they had. The wind might return, and yet they closed their eyes, because sleep was a necessity, because fear took too much energy, because, in the Dark Ages, rest was not the absence of worry, it was an act of rebellion against it. The fire hissed softly. The night deepened, and they dreamed not of spring, but of simply waking again to one more day. The cold had grown familiar, not softer, not kinder, just more known. By the 15th day, it was no longer a surprise to find a thin sheet of frost on the inside of the window, or to see the faintest vapor escape one's mouth even indoors. The family had adapted, as all those who survived the Dark Ages did. They no longer spoke of warmth as something they missed. It had become a memory, not a hope. Something lost, not something waited for. The fire was no longer a luxury. It was the center of the home, the anchor of each moment. Every activity revolved around it: teething, mending, storytelling, silence. The fire was life in its rawest, simplest form, flickering, consuming, never fully satisfying, but always necessary. The father tended it with reverence, like a priest before an altar. He knew which twigs caught best, which logs burned longest, which arrangements gave the steadiest heat. It was a knowledge passed down not in books, but in gestures, in scars. In the memory of those who had frozen, this morning the woodpile was dangerously low. Only 3 solid logs remained. The rest were scraps: bark, broken handles, the legs of an old stool. There was no more furniture left to burn that wouldn't cost them comfort or shelter. The father counted the pieces with his eyes, not aloud, saying it would make it real, and some things were better left unspoken. He bundled himself in layers of patched wool and stepped outside. The snow was up to his waist now, crusted over at the top with a layer of ice that cracked with each step. His breath fogged the air, a ghost that followed him with each exhale. He wasn't going far, just to the edge of the small woods, where he hoped some fallen branches might still be buried beneath the drift. Carrying an axe was pointless. Everything was too frozen to cut. Back inside, the children sat close to their mother. She taught them how to twist straw into braids that could be used to bind or insulate. The motion was slow and meditative, a rhythm of fingers and breath. The youngest boy struggled to keep the strands tight, but the others helped. Even in hunger, even in cold, they had learned that survival was always shared. No one endured alone. The daughter, the second oldest, took over the fire when her mother moved to the corner to work on preserving a few strips of dried meat. It was thin meat, mostly gristle, but she soaked it in hot water and added ash to clean it, then laid it on a flat stone near the coals too warm. It wouldn't be a feast, but it would stretch. When the father returned, his face was pale, his hands red from cold, but he smiled thinly, quietly. He had found some frozen branches and a rotted stump. Not much, but something. Enough for a day, maybe 2. They pulled off the snow, carried the bundles in, and stacked them near the hearth, each piece drying slowly in the warm air. As twilight approached, the clouds darkened again. Snow threatened more snow. The sky seemed to press lower against the earth, as if the world was shrinking under the weight of winter. The family moved slower now, not from weakness, but to conserve. Even breath, even gestures, were measured. Dinner that night was a thin soup, flavored with garlic husk and the last of the barley. They took turns with the ladle. There was no pretense of full bellies, only the reality of survival. The taste didn't matter. The heat did. Afterward, the mother brought out a small piece of cloth wrapped tightly around something precious, a single beeswax candle. They had saved it for emergencies. But tonight she lit it not because they were in danger, but because they were tired. Sometimes, light was worth more than logic. The flame was soft, yellow, steady. It cast gentle shadows across the dirt walls, and made the room feel smaller, closer. The children stared into it, as though it were magic. And perhaps, in some way, it was. A single flame, burning in defiance of the wind and snow outside, felt like hope distilled into light. The father told a story this time. His voice was rough but steady. He spoke of a hunter from the north who had once followed a deer through a snowstorm, and found instead an entire village buried beneath ice. A place frozen in time, its fires still warm, its people asleep. No one ever knew if it was true. That didn't matter. The point was that even in ice, there might be warmth. Somewhere, somehow, later, as they lay down together, the fire low but alive, the candle still burning, they whispered their goodnights, not with words, but with closeness, with hands held, with shared breath. The snow began to fall harder outside. The wind returned. It scraped against the roof, rattled the shutter, clawed at the door frame. But the family didn't stir. They had fire. They had each other. They had one more night, and, in the dark ages, that was enough. When the 16th night gave way to morning, it did so without ceremony. The sky remained the same endless gray, the kind of sky that felt older than the earth beneath it. No bird call marked the dawn, no rooster cry rose in the distance. The sound of the wind shifting through branches crusted with ice. In the dark ages, Even the turning of the world was silent. The family had survived another night, not triumphantly, not with fanfare, but simply quietly. In a time when the line between sleep and death was sometimes thin and uncertain, waking together was a small miracle. The fire had lasted through the night, just barely. A thin wavering flame remained, struggling against the weight of its own exhaustion. The mother stirred first. She moved slowly, as if her body remembered warmth from a dream that the room could no longer offer. She pulled her shawl tighter, shook the snow from her boots near the door, and gently added a sliver of bark to the fire's edge. The eldest son had developed a cough during the night. Dry, shallow, persistent, not yet dangerous, but worrying. The mother brought him warm water and wrapped a cloth around his chest, dampened with thyme-scented water from last autumn's harvest. It was an old remedy. Whether it helped or not, hardly mattered. The act of care itself was what mattered most. Outside, the world remained unchanged, blanketed in white, unmoving. The snow had settled deep in the hollows, bent the branches, buried the trails. There were no tracks, no signs of life, as if the world beyond the cottage had vanished entirely, erased by winter. Inside, small hands began to stir grain from a clay pot. What remained of the oats was ground to mush, mixed with melted snow, and heated near the coals. The mixture was flavorless but warm, and warmth, in these days, was the only luxury anyone remembered how to ask for. That afternoon, the father returned to the outer shed, a structure barely held together by frostbitten wood and memory. It had once stored hay, but now was mostly used to keep tools drithers that hadn't rusted or been scavenged for iron. He took the dull axe and examined its edge. It needed sharpening, but there was no whetstone left. Still, he would use it. He always did. He wandered the snow-packed edge of the forest, following the same narrow trail he had used for weeks. The world beyond had grown quiet. Even the small animals, rabbits, stoats, mice, had disappeared from sight. Their prints no longer crossed the snowdrifts. Either they had gone to ground, or they had been taken by the cold thought. The father paused. Near an old elm, long dead, its limbs brittle and exposed like ribs. He struck at a low branch, and the wood cracked with a dry, hollow sound. A good sound, dead wood, but dry. That was something. He gathered what he could only. A handful, but in winter, every scrap was victory. Back at the cottage, the others worked. The mother rewove a fraying mat of straw, meant to be placed near the door to keep out the drifting cold. The youngest children pressed their hands into the clay walls, smoothing out cracks with patches of wet earth. The eldest daughter unspooled a length of thread she had made from twisted flax, and began to repair a torn sleeve. No task was small. No gesture was wasted. As evening fell, the sky darkened, not just with the usual gloom of winter, but with a strange heaviness. The wind had died down, replaced by a stillness that seemed unnatural. The air grew thick. The father stood at the window and watched. More snow, he said softly, not a question, a truth. They prepared the fire early. The remaining wood was split carefully, some burned now, some saved for later in the night. They ate a thin broth, this time flavored with old onion peels and wild herbs dried months ago. The warmth of the meal filled their bellies just enough to quiet the ache. Later, the candle was lit again. The second to last one. Its light spilled over the faces of the children, casting long shadows against the walls. They gathered close around it, not for warmth, but for its rare glow. Fire warmed the body. Candles warmed the heart. Tonight's story was about a tree that never lost its leaves, even in the deepest winter, and how the people of a village once danced around it to keep the snow away. The children smiled sleepily. No one truly believed the story, but that wasn't the point. Stories weren't meant to be true. They were meant to keep truth away, just long enough to let sleep come. The wind returned at midnight, howling, angry. It beat against the walls like a beast denied entrance. The shutters groaned. The smoke from the fire leaned sideways, trying to escape the draft. The father fed the fire again. The mother pulled the children closer. The room held the storm at bay. They closed their eyes. The candle burned low. The snow fell harder, but they endured. Not by force, not by magic. Just by staying, by breathing, by being. and in the heart of a winter that had forgotten how to end, they survived once more. The 17th day was neither darker nor brighter than the others, but it carried a weight of weariness that clung to the walls like smoke. Every object in the cottage, the pot by the fire, the worn wooden bench, the bundle of wool at the foot of the bed, seemed older than it had been yesterday. As if the cold had not just frozen the world, but aged it. The morning began with silence. Not peace, not rest, just a hollow, echoing silence. Even the wind had gone quiet, as if it had run out of breath. Only the faint pop of a shrinking coal in the hearth marked the passage of time. The mother awoke slowly. Her movements were stiff, her hands numb despite being tucked beneath layers of cloth through the night. She rubbed them together and leaned over the fire, coaxing it gently. Her fingers were raw, the skin cracked from dryness and cold. There was no ointment left, only linen wraps and the memory of warmth. The children stayed asleep longer than usual. There was no school, no church bell, no reason to rise except for the instinct to move before the cold settled deeper. The father remained motionless for a time as well, listening not to sounds, but to what he couldn't hear. The absence of life outside, the birds, the trickle of the frozen stream, the creak of trees was louder than any storm. When he finally stood, he did so slowly, careful not to wake the youngest, curled beside him. He layered his clothing with practiced movements. The cloak he wore had been patched so many times that none of the original cloth remained. It was a collage of frayed fabrics, stitched together over years, each square a memory of hardship. He stepped outside with the axe slung over one shoulder. The air stung immediately, biting through layers. The snow crunched differently now. It had frozen hard, like stone. Each step took more effort, more will. But he moved because there was no alternative. At the edge of the woods, the silence was complete. He swung the axe not to fell trees, but to break apart an old log he'd found buried under snow days ago. The work was slow. He rested often. Each swing was a gamble, strength against exhaustion. But eventually, he split it. The sound echoed briefly, then vanished into the white void. Back at the cottage, the mother had prepared a small breakfast, a thin gruel of ground chestnut mixed with ash-sifted water. It had no color, no scent, but it was warm. The children took their turns silently, holding the clay bowl between both hands, letting its warmth seep into their skin before sipping from it. After eating, the daughter resumed her weaving. She was crafting a strip of cloth, not for clothing, but for the window frame to plug the gaps where wind crept through. She worked slowly, fingers trembling. The thread was coarse, dyed faintly with elderberries from long ago. The color was nearly gone, like the season it had come from. The father returned, dragging the split log on a makeshift sled made from an old door. He said nothing, only nodded. The others helped him lift it into the cottage, and he began cutting it into smaller pieces. They would dry it near the fire for a few hours before burning it. It was too green to light easily, but they had no choice. The sky outside remained colorless. Snow hung in the air again, though not falling yet. It hovered, waiting. Winter was patient, it didn't need to hurry. As evening approached, the fire was fed more generously than usual. They knew the coming night would be colder than the last. The walls seemed to know it too, creaking and snapping as the temperature dropped. Dinner was shared without speech, a paste of dried beans, long soaked and softened near the hearth. The youngest made a game of scooping his portion with a flat piece of bark, pretending it was a ship sailing across the sea of his wooden plate. The other smiled, not because it was funny, but because smiling helped. Afterward, they gathered near the candle again. The final candle, it sat in its wooden holder like a jewel. The mother hesitated before lighting it, a moment of decision. Then, with a steady hand, she struck the flint. The tiny flame bloomed, its light spread slowly, brushing against faces, casting soft shadows on the low ceiling beams. The children stared, their eyes wide with quiet wonder. Candles were rare, but a candle on the 17th night of deep winter, that was a miracle. The father spoke then, just a few words. He told of a tale passed down from his grandfather of a winter so long that even the rivers forgot how to flow, and a family who kept their warmth not with fire, but with laughter. They laughed until spring found them. "We've run out of Laughter, he added, gently. But no one contradicted him. The night was long. They stayed awake longer than usual, watching the candle, whispering small thoughts, threading cloth through numb fingers. No one wanted to sleep. Sleep meant time would pass, and time passing meant more cold, less fuel, fewer stories. Eventually, the flame dimmed, the fire burned low again, the candle guttered. They lay down, limbs tangled beneath wool and straw in silence. And once again, in the heart of the cold, they survived, because they had no other choice, and because that was what people did in the Dark Ages. They survived. Morning came, not with brightness, but with a dim shift in the gray of the sky, as if the world reluctantly agreed to keep turning. The family stirred slowly, each movement weighed down by fatigue that had become as much a part of them as their breath. 17 nights of winter had passed. This was the 18th, and it felt no warmer, no shorter, no kinder than the first. The fire had burned to a crust of ash. A few faint embers still pulsed like the last heartbeats of a dying bird. The mother knelt before them, coaxing the heat to life again. She didn't speak. Her hands moved with habitual reverence. 2 small pieces of bark, a few dry shavings, and the last of the kindling were offered to the coals. A whisper of smoke rose, followed by the faintest flicker of flame. Enough. The father sat upright, stretching his arms against the stiffness that gripped his joints. He'd felt it worse each morning. Not illness, exactly just age, cold, and the cumulative weight of survival. He didn't complain. He never had. His silence had always been his greatest effort. He stood and walked to the door, cracking it open against a crust of snow that had sealed it in the night. A slow groan of wood, a sigh of icy air, and then a wall of white greeted him. The snow had fallen heavily, soundlessly, in the dark hours. It reached up to the lowest beam of the outer wall now. The path he had once walked daily to the trees was gone, buried, vanished. He closed the door again without a word. Inside, the children woke, one by one. The youngest whimpered in his sleep, disturbed by a cold dream. The eldest rubbed warmth into his sister's fingers. The mother distributed boiled water not for drinking, but for cupping in their hands, to thaw the ache of cold. They passed the clay bowls from hand to hand like sacred objects. There was no food left that morning, not even broth. They had scraped the last smear of beans from the bottom of the pot the night before. Now, their hunger was no longer sharp, it was dull, stretched thin like the rest of their senses. There was no panic, just a quiet resignation. The father sat beside the fire and examined a bent iron nail he had pulled from the broken sled. He rolled it between his fingers, thinking, if he could shape it, he might repair the latch on the door. It wouldn't warm them, but it would protect them. And sometimes, protection was the only warmth left. The eldest daughter was working quietly, weaving strips of cloth into a crude curtain to hang across the entrance of the sleeping corner. It wouldn't stop the cold, but it would slow it. And more than that, it would make the space feel smaller, closer, less exposed to the winter beyond the walls. Outside, the sky remained blank. Not snowing, not clear, just gray. Timeless. Kind of sky that looked the same at dawn and dusk. So that one might live an entire day and never be sure it had passed. By midday, the father made a decision. He would not go to the woods. Not today. Not with the snow this deep. He would stay. Preserve energy. Wait for a better moment, if one came. The woodpile was nearly gone, but he split what was left with care. One large log, divided into 6 narrow pieces. Enough for the day. Perhaps the night. The family gathered close to the fire as it was built up again. The flames rose slowly, licking the new wood, sending shadows dancing on the walls. The warmth it gave was shallow, but real. Enough to make the fingers work. Enough to stop the cough from worsening. They sat in a circle. No one asked for food. No one asked for when the snow might stop. These questions had been used up long ago. Instead, the mother told a story, not an old one, but one she made up on the spot. A story about a mouse who lived inside a fallen log and dreamed of spring, of sunlight and fresh grass and warm stones to sleep on. The children listened, their faces blank at first, then slowly brightening with each imagined detail. Stories they had learned were like kindling. They could catch fire in the coldest minds. They could burn just long enough to forget the hunger, to forget the wind. As dusk fell, they placed stones near the fire to warm. Later, the stones would be wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath their bedding. It wouldn't stay warm for long, but long enough to sleep. The mother took out a small bundle, a twist of cloth tied with string. Inside was a bit of dried apple, saved for a time when it was most needed. She split it 5 ways, a sliver for each of them. The taste was sharp, sweet, almost unreal. The youngest boy smiled. It was the first food to taste like memory. They lit no candle that night. There were none left. The darkness was complete, except for the flickering firelight. Shadows rose and fell on the walls like old ghosts. The father hummed a tune. No one knew the words. Maybe there were none. But the sound filled the room like warmth. The children closed their eyes. The fire crackled. The snow pressed against the house, quiet but insistent. And still, they endured. Because in the dark ages, warmth was not just fire, it was presence. It was breath. It was not being alone. The 19th morning dawned colder still, though the difference was impossible to measure beneath the unyielding blanket of snow. The sky, an endless sheet of slate, pressed down on the village as if to silence even the thought of spring. The family awoke with aching limbs and hollow eyes, yet the day demanded their quiet resilience. Inside the cottage, the air was thin and sharp with cold. The fire was little more than a memory and the hearth embers long extinguished. The mother moved with careful slowness, each step deliberate to conserve warmth and energy. She stirred a small pot of water, heating it near the last flicker of flame from the tiny scraps of kindling left. The smell was faint, almost a ghost of comfort. The children shivered beneath their threadbare blankets, their faces pale and cheeks pinched from cold. The youngest clutched a small wooden toy, worn smooth by fingers and time. It was one of the few things that held the warmth of childhood, though even that warmth was fading. The father dressed quickly, pulling layers upon layers of tattered cloth and animal skins. The weight of survival rested heavy on his shoulders, but he bore it silently. There was no room for weakness here. He opened the door, a thin sheet of ice cracking underfoot. The snow outside was deep enough to swallow footsteps whole. In minutes, he set out to gather what little the winter would offer. The woods were merciless, stripped bare of leaves, and the underbrush stiff with frost. He searched for dead branches, snapped off brittle twigs, and any scrap of wood that could be fed to the fire. Each piece was a victory, small and quiet. Time passed slowly, marked only by the shifting light filtering weakly through the gray sky. Back inside, the mother tended to the children, rubbing their cold hands and whispering soft encouragements. There was no food, only the memory of meals past, and the thin hope of spring as night approached. The family huddled together near the hearth, wrapped in layers in each other. The father lit a small fire, its flames flickering with a desperate hunger. The warmth was fleeting but precious, a fragile shield against the encroaching cold. In the dim light, they spoke little. Words were costly. Energy had to be saved. Instead, they shared stories, old tales passed down through generations. Stories of seasons when the cold would break, when the earth would thaw, and the sun would return. These stories were like fragile sparks, lighting the darkness inside. Their hearts, the youngest child fell asleep first, his breath shallow but steady. The others followed, eyes heavy with exhaustion but minds clinging to the warmth of family and hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall silently. Piling higher, a white silence that threatened to erase all signs of life. Yet inside the small cottage, despite hunger, cold, and fear, the family endured. Because survival in the dark ages was not just about withstanding the cold. It was about holding on to the fragile threads of humanity that the winter could not freeze. The 20th night arrived with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the snow lay thick and undisturbed, a heavy quilt muffling every sound. Inside the humble cottage, the family gathered one last time around the fire, its glow, weak but steady, a beacon against the endless cold. Their faces were drawn and pale, carved by the relentless winter, but their eyes held a quiet strength born from weeks of shared hardship. They had weathered the coldest nights, survived the hunger and the darkness. and clung to one another through the longest stretch of winter the Dark Ages had thrown at them. The mother carefully divided the last scraps of dried fruit, a precious treasure saved for this final evening. Each bite was small, sweet, and savored beyond words. The children smiled faintly, their thoughts momentarily free from the ache of cold and hunger. The father rose and went to the door, looking out at the vast white landscape that stretched to the horizon. The snowstorm had passed, leaving a frozen world sparkling faintly under a pale moon. He closed the door gently and returned to his family. They spoke quietly then, sharing memories of better times and whispered hopes for spring's return. The stories they told were less about survival now, and more about the promise of warmth, of green fields, flowing rivers, and skies that shone blue again. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, the family settled down, wrapped in threadbare blankets, their bodies closed for warmth. The mother's hand rested gently on the youngest child's forehead, a soothing touch in the deep silence. Outside, the cold night stretched endlessly, but inside, a fragile flame of hope burned bright. It was not the fire in the hearth, but the fire within the unyielding spirit of those who endure. And so, in the heart of the Dark Ages, through the coldest nights and the darkest days, they survived not just by fighting the winter, but by holding fast to each other and to the hope of spring. They survived.